Across America, voters in 5 states had abortion rights on the ballot. In all of those cases, voters decided to protect rather than eliminate those rights. In Kentucky, getting an abortion is still illegal in most cases, but voters rejected a measure that would amend the state constitution to eliminate the right to an abortion. To talk about all of this, I'm joined by Ryland Barton, managing editor of Kentucky Public Radio, and Tracy Weitz, a sociology professor at American University. Thank you both for joining me.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start out by asking you, Ryland, about what is happening in Kentucky, since so far we know that the battle for abortion rights is not entirely over. What can you tell, at least legally, what can you tell us about what's going on there?
Right. So on Election Day, Kentucky voters rejected an amendment that basically would have made it harder to challenge Kentucky's near total ban on abortion. Kentucky had one of the trigger laws that outlaws abortion in almost all cases. And what that would have done is said that there's no guaranteed right to abortion under the Kentucky Constitution. That is the very thing that advocates are arguing in Kentucky. The state Supreme Court will hear a lawsuit that argues that there is a right to abortion under the Kentucky Constitution, and this would hamper the lawmakers' ability to regulate abortion just about out of existence, as they've tried to do in Kentucky. And it'll be very interesting going into, say, the next legislative session, however the court rules in this case.
When you saw Kentucky, a generally Republican state, reject this measure, what does that tell you about the state of abortion rights and people's thoughts around them in America after Roe v. Wade was overturned?
Abortion has always been more popular than either political party, right? So this pivot that everybody needs to make now, I think is a surprise to people, because for a long time, people thought that the reason Democrats weren't winning was that Democrats weren't appealing to pro-life moderates. But in fact, there really aren't these pro-life moderates, that when people are asked their opinion specifically about abortion, they overwhelmingly support people's right to do this to make these decisions on their own, to make them with their families. And they do not want to see these issues criminalized. So I think that what the Democratic Party will take from this is an understanding that it no longer needs to be so soft or so mild on abortion, that it actually can move forward to concretize and solidify abortion rights in legislation, both federal legislation and state level legislation.
So the state legislature put this amendment forward. Who were the people on either side of this, and what were they saying about this measure?
So a lot of the supporters of this amendment, very anti-abortion Republicans, but I think that so Kentucky has elected a lot of politicians over the years that have passed laws trying to ban abortion, but I think that what this vote really showed is that there's a lot more nuance here among voters. Voters, I think, when asked the question if they want to allow the legislature to continue regulating abortion out of existence, that gave a lot of people pause. I think that a lot of what drove this is worries about too much government regulation. I think that that's kind of what comes down to for some of these more conservative voters, where they were actually spooked by what this would ultimately allow happen. So there was this kind of coalition of some of your traditional abortion rights advocates in Kentucky, combining with some people who you wouldn't imagine normally voting for something like this, because it was just so much of would provide so much power to the legislature to regulate abortion.
Tracy, the GOP largely campaigned on an anti-abortion stance. What's the thinking behind that, and what's been their playbook after the Dobbs decision?
Well, I think it's such an excellent question to think about when we look at what the public opinion, as Ryland just said, is that the vast majority of Americans do not want these healthcare decisions criminalized. But it's been a very convenient way for the GOP to build political power, in particular with conservative evangelical voters who prior to the sort of abortion fight really were not participating in the political process. And so for a long time, this has been an issue that has driven a very base level voter, but hasn't really engaged the sort of middle or moderate voter. And so now when people are being truly finding out that this has not just been political posturing, but actually states are banning and criminalizing healthcare decisions and that it's having an impact on their neighbors, on their friends, on their coworkers, on their family, and even on themselves, that it doesn't line up with what they thought they were voting for. And so the GOP now has to decide how do they pivot in the moment in which they have used this as a political tool for so long, but with very limited consequences because the court has always stepped in. And so now they have to actually reap what they sow, and they have to just figure out, can they find a way to continue to be in power when their policies are so out of step with their general voter?
Ryland, this now goes to the state Supreme Court. What will the judge hear from either side in this sort of extension of the battle?
Well, what the advocates who brought this lawsuit are going to argue is that there's a constitutional right to abortion, basically under, as it should be construed as like a privacy right, which is kind of how Roe v. Wade was construed as well. So they're going to be arguing that the court should interpret, a right to abortion under the state's fundamental legal document. The opponents to that, which include the state's attorney general and the legislature, they're arguing that abortion isn't even mentioned in the state constitution, that this would be a fabrication of a right that doesn't exist, which is, ultimately what a lot of the opposition to the Roe v. Wade decision and what kind of came down in Dobbs really settled on. So it does come down to these justices. It's very interesting to me that they scheduled this for 1 week after Election Day, 1 week after this vote took place. And they said when they first agreed to take on this case that they're paying attention to that vote.
I want to ask you both this, but let's start with you, Ryland. How closely do you think people are watching this?
I think people are watching it very closely. Something like this, which has immediate implications after the election. There was very high voter turnout comparatively for a midterm election in Kentucky. It was about 52%. We were expecting about 41. That's kind of normal for a midterm election in Kentucky. So this is really an issue that I think has engaged voters, that got people out to the polls and really has a lot of people thinking. So people are watching to see how the court decides this.
Yeah, I think we've seen young people who, especially people of reproductive age, they've never actually had to think about this issue. It's always been protected for them. And so the idea now that it's up to them to decide if abortion is going to continue, they care a lot about this issue. And so I think we, as Ryland said, we saw voter engagement, in midterms. And then we will see, I think, continued interest in this issue. Michigan, Kansas, Montana, California, Vermont, all of which showed that voters had abortion on their mind. And it was one or two of the most important issues that they were going to vote on.
Tracy, how closely will you be watching things play out in the state Supreme Court in Kentucky? And do you think that Kentucky and Kansas will be a part of paving the way in terms of abortion rights across the country?
Yeah, we think we're watching all the state Supreme Courts, right? It's also Iowa, it's Ohio, it's Montana, it's Arizona. The state Supreme Courts are going to have to weigh in on this issue in ways that they have never had to do before. And then the voters are going to need to weigh in. One of the things I think many people forget is that we often in these states vote on Supreme Court justices. And so I think this is just the beginning of the wave. First, we will see the state Supreme Courts make decisions about abortions, and we'll all be watching those. But then we need to continue to watch and continue to be vigilant about the votes for state Supreme Court seats.
What else will you be thinking about as voters continue to tackle this issue of abortion rights?
I think one big thing that viewers should be paying attention to and thinking about is what a legislature might do next after a court decision, after court decides one way or another over something like this. I'm thinking a lot about that for Kentucky's legislature, where it's kind of hard to imagine lawmakers passing any sorts of exception to the state's abortion ban on their own. Again, how might the court though lead them to make certain decisions, or how is this going to be litigated and legislated in the future?
Yeah, I think there's two things that people need to think about that they might not be on their mind right now. The first is that we are going to see an expansion of who's caught up in criminalization around these issues. So in states where they have criminalized abortion, they are contemplating using aiding and abetting statutes to go after parents, friends, family members who assist people either in obtaining information so that they can leave a state to get abortion, or helping them acquire or self-source medication so that they can do the abortions on their own. And I think we have to be very careful about watching how broad that criminalization happens. So that's one thing I think people need to pay attention to. It's not just the doctors. It's not just the people who are pregnant. It's everybody who's trying to support them. And the second thing I think we need to be very cautious of is how we think exceptions might solve a problem. So people are more supportive of abortion if it's for rape or incest, or in the case of life endangerment. But in all of those cases, we know that those laws don't actually provide those services in reality. So you can have an exception in the law, but healthcare providers don't offer those services. Institutions don't offer those services because people don't actually know how to thread the needle and prove something is an exception.
Tracy Weitz with American University and Ryland Barton with Kentucky Public Radio. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you for having us.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nicole Ellis.